Right. Welcome back to Philosophy 110 Human Nature. This is the third lecture, Immanuel Kant on Enlightenment. And I hope that this video will be a lot shorter than the last two because the piece that we're talking about today is far shorter as well. Um, so who is Immanuel Kant? Immanuel Kant is probably one of the most, if not the most important philosopher in modern philosophy, modern meaning um, sort of time period of philosophy since the 17th century. Kant was born in the city of Königsberg, which was a part of the Kingdom of Prussia, which also is now part of Germany. But actually, today Königsberg is a part of the country of Russia. Um, and Kant was raised in a very devout Lutheran family, and Kant himself was a pretty devout Lutheran throughout his life. An interesting part about Kant is that despite his global impact, and despite many of his writings, wherein he also did talk about things like world peace, Kant never actually left the city of Königsberg. He was born in Königsberg, he was educated in Königsberg, he pursued his career in Königsberg, and he died in Königsberg. Um, and Kant was pretty well known for being a very sort of orderly, eccentric person. There's always accounts that Kant would always take walks around Königsberg every day, and people would be able to set their clocks knowing the exact time that Kant would walk past their house. So he's a really interesting figure. But yeah, he never left Königsberg. And Kant is known for a wide variety of philosophical ideas, but he's known for this doctrine called transcendental idealism, which you don't have to get into necessarily today, but transcendental idealism is basically sort of a synthesis of the best parts of rationalism and the parts of empiricism, if you're early with some of the debates in early modern philosophy. He offered a deontological moral theory, which means that he thought that sort of morality ultimately rests on our obligations and our duties that we have to each other, and that morality can't be a matter of fiat or can't be a matter of just circumstances or consequences. Finally, as far as political philosophy, he's known for developing rights-based liberalism. So Kant was one of the major founding figures of modern liberal philosophy, which he grounded within sort of a rights-based framework. Some of his known works include Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, The Three Critiques, which consists of three different books, the most well-known being The Critique of Pure Reason, and his essay on perpetual peace. Okay. So Kant's essay, as you read, was about the significance of the Enlightenment. And I know we mentioned the Enlightenment briefly in our Rousseau lectures, but just for a quick recap for those of you who might have not learned that much about the Enlightenment was a philosophical, political, and cultural movement that took place in Europe during the 18th century primarily. And in many ways, the Enlightenment was a continuity of the scientific revolution that took place during the 16th and 17th centuries. So if you think of people like Kepler or Copernicus, although they predated the Enlightenment, a lot of their sort of ideas about the role of science in society kind of laid the foundations for the Enlightenment, which went beyond science and just a conversation about science. Some major ideas of the Enlightenment include popular sovereignty and the rule of law. So this idea that a political authority should ultimately be based on the consent of the governed, and that everyone should be subjected to the law. No one should be above the law. No king, no president, no politicians, no elites. No one is above the law. Everyone should be accountable to it. This idea of separation of church and state. Constitutional government, so the idea that any government should be limited by a written constitution. Secular humanism, or this idea that our political social institutions should be structured to serve the interests of humanity, not just the interest of a certain religion or a certain dogma or a certain doctrine. And individualism, this idea that the individual, that we should have a sort of central concern for the basic dignities of individuals, and not just for the state. And what was interesting about the Enlightenment was that a lot of Enlightenment ideas, propagated through, things like salons. So salons back then were sort of these kind of like clubs or dinner parties where people would get together and sort of talk about philosophical ideas. It also propagated through cafes, clubs, and through pamphlets and journals. So, a couple centuries before, the printing press was invented in Germany. The printing press laid the foundations for the Protestant Reformation, because before the Protestant Reformation, Christians had to rely on their sort of local clergy to interpret the Bible for them, because only a local clergy could speak Latin or read Latin, or sorry, read Greek or read Hebrew, and to give rites in Latin. But when the printing press came about, people started to translate Bibles into their native languages, which made it possible for people to read and interpret interpret Christianity sort of on their own means, right? And this led to the Protestant Reformation, among other reasons. But also the printing press laid the foundations for independent media. Um, so, if you think about it, before these two things, right, your average person had to rely on other means to kind of get information or to get their worldviews, whether it's the church, whether it's their local lord, they always had to defer to some other authority for that. But one of the sort of biggest ideas of the Enlightenment, which we'll see in Kant's essay, is that it was a movement predicated on the idea that people or individuals have the power to sort of make decisions and make judgments on their own accord. Um, and a lot of these ideas might seem familiar or commonsensical to us because the Enlightenment informed the American and French Revolutions. So the United States and its sort of political system was ostensibly at least founded on Enlightenment principles, right? Similar to the French Revolution, which we discussed in the last lecture on Rousseau. So Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, was written for a German magazine called the Berlin Monthly, which is strange to think about, because nowadays it's very hard to find, philosophical op-eds on major monthly or weekly or monthly magazines, right? But the editorial team for this magazine sort of sent out an advert asking people to submit essays answering the question about what is enlightenment, right? So it was very similar to how Rousseau submitted his essay on the origin of inequality for an essay prize competition. So it's interesting how these sort of essays were, in many ways, kind of written for a broader public, right? Not just for the established intellectual literati. And in What is Enlightenment, Kant proposes his own understanding of the Enlightenment as, quote, mankind's exit from its self-incurred immaturity. Different translations word it differently. But it's basically this idea that, the Enlightenment is this movement predicated on the notion that individuals have now developed the means to sort of think for themselves and to rely on their own capacity for reason without the guidance of others, right? So if you think about it, in our daily lives, we're accustomed toward being reliant on other people to make decisions for us. And sometimes this might be justified, right? If you have an illness, it might be better to go with the doctor's advice than with your own advice, right? But after a while, when we get used to this, it habituates us to not trust ourselves and not have confidence in our own capacity for reason. Also, just relying on rules or formulas that are already made for you to dictate our lives also is a form of reliance on other things, right? You're using this sort of mechanical understanding of these rules and formulas, but you don't have this kind of wit or cunning to be able to adapt to emergent situations. So Kant writes, quote, "It is easy to be immature. If I have a book that has understanding for me, a pastor who has conscience for me, a doctor who judges my diet for me, and so forth, surely I do not need to trouble myself. I have no need to think. If only I can pay. Others will take over the tedious business for me." So, in a large part of the essay, Kant makes a distinction between what he calls the public use of reason and the private use of reason. So the private use of reason is the kind of reason that we make based off our own civil posts or our own offices or our own positions in society, right? So Kant uses the example of the preacher. So the preacher doesn't rely on public reason, which we'll get into what that means here in a second. The preacher relies on private reason because, the preacher's reason is based off his position as someone who's responsible for his congregation. And likewise, a soldier, definitely doesn't use his own public capacity for public reason, the soldier's private reason consists of simply following orders from their superiors. But it'll make you a bad soldier if you use your own free reason, but it'll make you a good soldier if you just follow orders and not question. Right? So Kant's not talking when Kant talks about the Enlightenment is about our ability to use our own reasoning. He's not necessarily talking about the private use of reason. What he wants to talk about is the public use of reason. And the public use of reason is, quote, an unrestricted freedom to use one's own reason to speak in one's own person. The best example that Kant can think of for someone who has the capacity for the public use of reason is scholars, very conveniently, right? But scholars, because scholars, the kind of work that they do is that they're trying to sort of ascertain the truth. They're trying to sort of get to the truth. And so doing, they're not necessarily doing so for the arbitrary interests, like based off their positions as a preacher, or their positions as a soldier, their position as a king. They're doing it because they're addressing this broad public, right? Which is why it's the public use of reason. Obviously, this is a very naive understanding of how scholarship works because, there's a lot of interests implicated in scholarship, and we won't get into that here. But for Kant, at least, ideally, the scholar sort of exhibits this sort of capacity for the public use of reason. So Kant writes, in order for enlightenment to flourish, the public must have freedom, right? So if a public isn't free, then it's very unlikely that the people within the public are going to sort of develop the means to be able to use their own public use of reason. And Kant writes that, people shouldn't be bound to customs or traditions that prevent them from, expanding their own capacity for the public use of reason or for their own capacity to acquire new knowledge, right? So in this way, he critiques reliance on religious authority, which is kind of the sort of, you can see the continuation from the scientific revolution, right? Because, prior to the scientific revolution, people just relied on church dogma for their understanding of the world, as opposed to a more empirical understanding, evidence-based and empirical understanding of how it works, right? So Kant writes here, quote, one age cannot bind itself and thus conspire to place a succeeding age in a situation in which it becomes impossible for it to broaden its knowledge, to cleanse itself of errors, and to generally progress in enlightenment. That would be a crime against human nature, whose original destiny consists in this progress. And posterity would be fully justified to reject these resolutions as concluded in an authorized manner. And by that same token, Kant writes, any political authority, like a state, can't effectively rule for long if its only means to gain obeisance is by just saying that subjects need to obey and no questions asked, right? Instead, an enlightened state or an effective state rules by encouraging people to use their own public use of reason, right? And governs through the public use of reason, not through the private use of reason. So, if a state were to justify its legitimacy for the private use of reason, a king would say, oh, follow my orders because I'm the king, no questions asked, right? But a state that follows the public use of reason will understand its own legitimacy in terms of the fact that it encourages and is encouraged by the people to rule in light of public reason. So you can see the Enlightenment sort of liberalism shine through here. He writes, quote, when nature has under this hard shell developed the seed for which she cares most tenderly, namely the inclination and the vocation for free thinking, this works back upon the character of the people, who thereby become more and more capable of acting freely. And finally, even on the principles of government, which finds its advantage to treat man, who is now more than a machine, in accord with his dignity. So this differs pretty dramatically from Hobbes, right? Because from Hobbes, people basically were machines. And people should surrender their natural rights and follow the sovereign insofar as the sovereign can deliver peace and security. But Kant, Kant thinks that we need more than that. A state that wants to claim any sort of legitimacy has to be able to encourage and develop people to sort of think on their own through the public use of reason, not merely just the private use of reason.